Season 2 of the Black Tech Green Money podcast is brought to you by Lexus, who's been celebrating driveway moments for over 30 years with the Lexus December to Remember sales event, where you can find exclusive offers on the most popular Lexus models. Experience amazing at your Lexus dealer. Afrotech World 2020. Will Campbell is CEO at Quantasy & Associates, an award-winning creative agency. He's on the virtual stage to discuss how M&A, mergers and acquisitions, can play a pivotal role in helping you grow your business and achieve your vision.
I want to talk about why, briefly, mergers and acquisitions are so important, especially for multicultural companies and for Black businesses, is we need to create larger, more influential companies. So you might say, as an entrepreneur or a founder, hey, my goal is not to be some massive company. I really just want to pursue my passion. I really want to just, if I could change one life, I've done my job. I just want to make something that's right for, my family. And that's all great. But at the same time, the business community needs you. We need your ideas. We need your hustle. We need your innovation. And we need you to create larger, more influential companies. No matter what type of company you are, it helps you deepen the capacity that drives your mission. So as a visionary, as a person with an idea, M&A can become an incredible growth strategy that gives more capacity and more foundation to what your overall mission is.
I'm Will Lucas, and this is Black Tech Green Money. I want to introduce you to some of the biggest names, some of the brightest minds, and brilliant ideas. If you're Black in building or simply using tech to secure your bag, this podcast is for you. Elliott Robinson is partner at Bessemer Venture Partners. He has 15 years of international experience investing and partnering with world-class entrepreneurs and the technology companies that they lead. He spent 6 years focused on Series A and B investments, followed by 7 years and counting focused on growth stage Series C, D, and E opportunities. I asked Elliot about how cloud computing in the age of COVID might accelerate innovation in stubborn industries.
So I oftentimes like to leverage a quote from one of my favorite CEOs. Before I joined Bessemer, I was a partner at M12 Ventures, which was Microsoft's global venture fund. And in that role, I was lucky to spend some time with Satya Nadella, who's still the CEO of Microsoft. And it was probably maybe like 3 months ago after our earnings call or during an earnings call where Satya said, we've seen more digital transformation decisions and initiatives being taken by our client base and customers in the last 2 months than we have in the last 2 years. And what does that really mean? That means there's been some kind of legacy industries that have bought software in a certain way for two plus decades. On-prem software where people still have to come to your premise, sit there and swap out the CDs or download things onto your system. But now with the proliferation of cloud computing, you can do all of that remotely. You can continuously update and release new software. So when Satya says he's seen more digital transformation in the last 2 months than the last 2 years, what he's really saying is, powered by things like AWS and Azure and GCP, folks are just really pushing cloud software applications to the forefront, every part of the stack, from infrastructure to platform to kind of the software front end side. So for me, COVID has been an interesting thing because cloud was already moving quickly, but now everyone's working from home. We're working from home now, at least on the tech company side. We might be working from home indefinitely, or at least this remote first kind of work from home virtual world. So the areas that we're seeing, a lot of movement is, we call it future of work, but what does that really mean? That means people that are building distributed teams, startup founders in the ecosystem today. There was this thing where, you might have to move to a really cool city like LA to find, talent that you can hire and build your team. That's not necessarily the case right now or the future. It's kind of been like that the last few years. It's been some companies that started that way. But now you can build a 20, 30, 40, 50 person team, be totally distributed. Just in the States, you could have, headquarters, quote unquote, in LA, hire in New York, Austin, there's some great tech hubs like Detroit and Atlanta that are really bubbling up. So there's a bunch of software tools that most startups need to help manage that. How do you do remote learning, remote sharing? Of course, I think we're on Zoom today, and they just announced a bunch of new kind of integrations and tool sets to make more of a remote office environment even more effective. So we think about things like future of work with productivity tools, knowledge sharing tools, even down to the back office. That's actually one area that I'm really excited about. So companies that are dealing with international payroll, which is a space that we've been spending a lot of time, or distributed payroll, distributed HR, distributed, accounting software. All of these things are now going from in office to in the cloud. And the whole definition of what is an office, I think, is changing. The last thing I'll say on this topic, knowing a couple folks from the Afrotech team, one of the coolest things about Afrotech for me has just been, as an outsider, looking at the office culture. Yeah. It looks like the most fun place to work.
Right.
As an African-American venture capitalist, I can go weeks without necessarily seeing someone else that looks like me. And
it was a remarkable place.
One office I could work out of, it's probably Afrotech's office.
Right.
But now they're remote. So how do you take such a unique culture? I think it's called like Wind Down Wednesdays or Fridays or something really cool like that. But how do you pull that into Zoom? How do you pull that into, like a hop-in environment and make it cool? Bring the music in, bring the culture in. And I'm really excited about some of the opportunities that are coming there.
Is in that respect, how fast are companies growing today? With the ability with the efficiencies that cloud computing provides, and how does COVID change that? So if you look at 10 years ago, how fast companies were growing, how does that scale?
Exceptional question. And you said two things that I'm going to pick on. Not only are companies able to move faster in kind of a remote first environment, if you're willing to hustle. I actually think it's kind of a unique time for underserved founders. I don't like the whole underrepresented or minority. I think it's a trash term. We're just underserved.
Yeah.
So for underserved founders, I actually, you can take two sides of the coin. From a funding perspective, it's always been tough for us, right? And perhaps in a world where you can't necessarily spend time face-to-face, getting to know people, that'll be tougher. But from an operational standpoint, you can actually take a lot more meetings now. If I think about companies here in the Bay Area in LA, for example, when I used to fly into LA, I could only take 3 to 4 meetings a day because traffic was crazy. I tried to stay in Venice, Santa Monica, it was kind of a hub, but I love places like Culver City. I still love West Hollywood. And it would take me forever to get around. Now with Zoom and more of the remote work culture, you can bang out calls from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. any time zone. I'm on calls at 11 p.m. with my team in Europe and Tel Aviv. I started my day at 6 a.m. with my partner in Tel Aviv. We've got, folks in China now. We've got 2 offices in New York. So the whole idea of what your schedule looks like has changed. So typically where you are time constrained in a physical face-to-face environment, all of those things have moved. So again, picking on your first word of growth, I think you can take more business development, more potential customer pipeline meetings in a way you couldn't before. And then the second word that's used, I'm going to pick on, is efficiency. So I think everyone's business from like just a fixed cost basis has changed, right? Like, you might not need that office space. While it might be advantageous for you to have face-to-face time with your employees and your employee base to build that culture, maybe doing it remote is easier. People certainly aren't flying nearly as much. Last year, I think I logged like 120 nights in hotels. I'm at 0. Well, actually, I'm technically at like a couple. My wife and I took a little bit of a vacation just to get a change of scenery. But a lot of the fixed costs that are in an operation are now changed. It's not that they're gone; they've just changed. So where founders may have raised $1 million in their seed round or maybe a super angel round a year ago, and you have these like fixed costs to build things out. Now with everything remote and your ability to hire in lower cost geos and cities where the talent pools are just as good or sometimes even better, you can pull that money out. And as underserved founders, that's that's kind of like one of our skill sets. We've always made more out of less. So I'm pretty excited about some of those prospects as well.
That's a great tee up to my next question, because it would seem that because of the scale and relatively low cost of cloud computing, and the efficiencies that it provides, that startups may need less to do more things, right? But is that capital just being redeployed elsewhere versus how it would have historically been deployed against those fixed costs and et cetera, travel or those things, because the prices aren't necessarily going down?
Yeah, that's a good point. The way I look at it is if you're cutting, let's just say your annual budget for your startup is 500K. Let's just say that. Salaries for a couple of people, maybe you've reduced your office space or gotten rid of it. And if you freed up just even 100 grand out of your budget year over year in COVID versus pre-COVID, there's a bunch of different things you can do with that. What I've really liked is the whole gig economy has always been a thing, but I think in COVID, it's even different. So you can try new things on the marketing side, on the biz dev side, on the PR side that perhaps you couldn't have done before because you either needed it in-house or, the business had been working a certain way for a couple of years. So a smaller business couldn't have got the attention of a marketing or PR kind of shop in the way that it can now, where everything's disintermediated. So I think it's down to the business. To your comment of prices haven't come down, that's certainly the case because everyone's trying to meet their top line revenue goals. So while prices haven't changed, the one thing I can say is negotiating terms have changed. So in this world of uncertainty, there was a lot of software and cloud software tools that said, hey, this is a minimum 1-year commitment. A lot of things have changed in COVID where they've said, okay, well, everyone's business is kind of up in the air. Why don't we give the first 3 months away free? Or why don't you sign up for a year, but you don't have to pay us anything for the first 6 months. We just want to keep you locked in. If you're on kind of the accounting or controller side of a business, as some of these software licenses come up to renew, I would certainly be thinking about, renegotiating. I'm never going to tell you to, hard renegotiate and think you're going to get 50% off. But, a lot of companies that weren't potentially working with customers a year ago and in COVID, they're a lot more open to negotiating. So not just the fixed costs that have come out during COVID of being virtual, but even those same kind of virtual cloud software tools I've talked about and you and I have been discussing, you can go back to the drawing board and say, hey, beyond just a 10 or 15% haircut until things get back to normal, maybe we can change some of the payment terms. And that's another way to kind of extend your cash runway.
So let's think about like prices coming down from a different perspective because I'm not a VC, but it would appear to me that, buy-in to get in on these deals hasn't come down either with regards to, that capital being more flexibly deployed. So how do you read that, look, we're not doing as much, in these fixed costs, these travel expenses, but the prices of getting in on deals hasn't reduced?
Yeah, there's this weird macro thing that happened, and it's really a dual-sided equation. So one, the last 6 to 12 months, more capital has been raised or bigger funds have been raised than ever before. And then the other thing that happened on the other side of the equation is, unfortunately, in COVID, there's a lot of businesses that were impacted, but it's super volatile. So what I mean by that is, in aggregate, businesses are just dealing with uncertainty. So that means there's less companies that are still either hitting plan or beating plan. So on one side, you've got more capital that needs to go into these companies than ever. On the other side, you might have, it's not that like companies are failing, but you might have a smaller basket of companies that are really thriving in COVID who have either figured it out, they might be in a market or industry vertical that's actually got a COVID tailwind versus a headwind. So there's more capital than ever going after a smaller subset of opportunities. Therefore, just supply and demand, the prices have come up. But look, at the end of the day, like valuations, they're certainly meaningful in every company's life, every entrepreneur's life, every early teen's life, because it has to do with dilution and your own equity and what you own. What I would really be advising founders on is, and this doesn't necessarily change in COVID, but if some of the funds that wouldn't spend time with you pre-COVID now all of a sudden want to spend time with you. Like, you need to ask yourself why that is. And that could be on both sides. That could be they think you're, you're seeing some COVID headwinds and now it's like a good opportunity to get in cheap or cheaper than they think it would be, or you're really seeing some tailwinds and now they're all over you. I'm just like a very values-based person. So the question is, if they weren't spending time with you when things were good, like, perhaps that's not the right fit for you and your company and your core founding team for the next 2 or 3 years. Just really try to think about that fit. And we're also, the last comment I'll make on this is, we're going into a really unique time in this country. 2020 has been the craziest year I think all of us have experienced, certainly in my adult life. And all that means is uncertainty. And every kind of CEO and C-level or co-founding team is thinking about, what does the next 6 months look like for us? And that impacts everyone's business. So I think, a lot of founders are just, trying to stay conservative, stay the course, but also be flexible as the next 3 to 4 months are going to be really volatile when it comes to change.
Is it possible startups maybe taking more capital than they need?
Oh, for sure. I hate that I answer that so strongly. I'm not sure if it's a for sure, but it's certainly prudent. I think I had written a tweet a week or two ago, all caps, just saying, why is every company in America raising right now? And it actually is my last comment, which is why we're about to enter a period of uncertainty that we've never seen. So if you're a company that's performing relatively well to plan or even beating it, why not do it now before we enter into this kind of desert of uncertainty? So I certainly understand that. But I will make sure I address your question, which is, do I think companies are raising too much money? I think some companies certainly are. There's this mentality and just kind of a behavioral norm that happens when you raise enough capital to have 12 to maybe 18 months of cushion, and you can just crank that business out. You're thinking about efficiencies. You're always thinking about your balance sheet and your bottom line. Where sometimes if you raise so much capital ahead of plan, not only are you sitting there thinking about, what am I going to do with all this extra money I raised, but your investors are also thinking, well, look, the IRR clock is still ticking on my money that I gave you. I need to generate a return faster. So now we start adding on to fixed and variable costs at a rate that wasn't necessarily the original plan, right? And then the term that I always use is, I never want to put a founder or an executive team in a position of doing unnatural things.
Okay, that's good.
An Excel plan is just numbers in an Excel, but if your balance sheet is now boosted to a point where it doesn't reflect the plan, now everyone feels this pressure to change it, and that's not good for either side in my opinion.
Season 2 of the Black Tech Green Money podcast is brought to you by Lexus. Known for celebrating driveway moments for over 30 years, Lexus invites you to create more with exclusive offers on the most popular Lexus models at the December to Remember sales event. Experience amazing at your Lexus dealer. Being black means seeing people of other ethnicities and backgrounds realize the value of our sauce. They capitalize what we create. They monetize the culture we move. As a creator, I'm interested in the take of a VC like Elliot on how we, as the global leaders in what's hot in music, fashion, food, sports, and more, might finally be able to realize the reward in the marketplace for the ideas that we bring to the table. Elliott Robinson speaks on it.
So I'm going to take it 30,000 feet and then probably go down to like 10,000 maybe on the street level. I think 30,000 feet view, what I'm really excited by is the growing number of enterprise software and cloud software opportunities that I'm seeing founded by not just Black founders, but Latinx founders and women founders. Traditionally, for whatever reason, it actually makes a lot of sense. At least the last 5 to 10 years, a lot of the startup opportunities have been focused at consumer opportunities. Because while founders that look like me and you are underserved, consumers are underserved, right? There's this age-old adage. I started my career at an all-Black venture firm in DC called Bessemer Venture Partners, and we were the first investors in BET. So first investor in BET, Bob Johnson says all the time, if Syncom and Herb Wilkins didn't exist, BET wouldn't exist. We're the only investor who served the board from first investment until it was sold to Viacom. And then, in the middle of that, we invested in Kathy Hughes, who started Radio One and TV One. A lot of people said to us, well, there's already BET. Like, why on earth would you invest in Radio One and TV One? And we said, dude, I mean, we're talking about 15 million people and you give them one channel, and then we got 300 channels serving the rest of the community. This doesn't make any sense. I think historically, because our consumer base is seen as one very homogenous, which it's not. There's all different types of lanes inside of the Black consumer opportunity. But because we're underserved, there's just so much like clear, obvious opportunity to go after the consumer market. But I think in the enterprise space, it's like it would take a whole nother Zoom to really break down my views on why we're just seeing these opportunities and these entrepreneurs now. But I'm really excited by the diversity that's influencing kind of cloud and enterprise software. And that's where I as a cloud investor, and spending my time. Now I'm a later stage investor. We can talk about that a little bit, but I spend a lot of time with the early side, even down to the seed team, of going through all the lists of kind of Black and brown founders going after enterprise and making sure that Bessemer is meeting with them, and making sure that we're funding. We just funded one that we haven't announced yet, which I'm really excited about coming around, but one is certainly not enough. We don't have a set number, but in my own mind, I've got a number of where I'd like to see the portfolio go, and I'm really excited about that. On the street level, I think that I want to make this very nuanced. I think that one thing that has to change on the street level is like we as a underserved entrepreneur base and underrepresented investor base, we just got to think bigger. And that's like a really nuanced thing, because sometimes people hear me say that and they take it the wrong way. I'm not saying that we're not thinking big now. It's just that many times we're just trying to get from point zero or point -1, because the whole industry is stacked against us, to like getting through those first blocking and tackling. And we got to do that, right? Like we got to focus on getting out of the blocks, getting the business up, getting the first customers, getting the first users. But sometimes we focus so much on that we don't think about how big of an opportunity we are, not just on the consumer side, but enterprise technology, and now even on the frontier tech side. So I think on the street level, I spend a lot of my time, even with early stage entrepreneurs, that as a growth investor, I can't invest in now. And when we're tweaking the deck, of course, the blocking and tackling has to be there. How are we going to spend the first million? How do we get the MVP up? How do we get the first paying customers? But oftentimes we leave out the big picture of how big of an opportunity all of these things are for us. I will really feel great when we're not just talking about the first 25 Black entrepreneurs that raise $10 million, but the first 25 that exit for $1 billion plus. And it's coming. I'm just saying that sometimes you have to speak it into existence and also reverse engineer into that success. If we say that every time we raise $1 million, we're looking at a $500 million to $1 billion opportunity, if that's letter Z and we know what letter A is, let's really map out the letters in between. All I'm saying is sometimes we underestimate how big of an opportunity all these things are. So on a street level, that's where I spend a lot of my time, particularly working with early stage founders that I'm just not positioned to invest in yet. Because I want to see them get there to that $1 billion, that Series B, Series C, still thinking about that $1 billion plus opportunity.
No, I love that we're having this conversation, because, we don't have this conversation enough at this high level of, in late stage investing, because it's so hard to get capital in the first place, and for Black founders. And to that, in that regard, what has to happen in our ecosystem for more Black founders to get to Series A? Because getting that seed is difficult, but we're out here in the seed stage. Getting to Series A and then beyond that, I mean, there's very few of us in that regard. So what has to happen in the ecosystem for us to get to Series A, see more of us at Series A and get post?
Yeah, it's a complex question and discussion. I mean, look, the reality is for more Black founders to get to Series A, the venture capital industry has to change, like dramatically. And that is not an excuse for, underserved founders to not get to Series A. But this is the conversation I have internally here at the fund, and perhaps even more importantly with our LPs, so our limited partners that invest in the space.
So you're saying the entrepreneurs are here that are capable?
Oh, 1000%. I mean, we're actually like this, man, like, I don't know how much time you have, but this
Let's go.
This is something we got to break down. So like, if you think about the last 6 months of conversation, the unfortunate events of, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, it goes on, has created this kind of this movement of venture capital trying to figure out, like, what are we doing wrong? Like, why are these founders not getting funded at the levels, Bessemer included, quite frankly? And the one thing I was just writing and tweeting about this week, like, Black founders are the most over-advised, over-cohorted, over-mentored, over-office hour folks in the world. And sometimes it's like, hey, man, we just want to lose your money at the same rate as all of our Caucasian colleagues, right? Like, venture capital by design is kind of a 80-20 sport. Like, 80% of our investments either go sideways or are a loss. And many times those same founders that lost your money in 2 or 3 years come back to the table and you give them money again because they learned.
Right. Right.
They're backable. So again, that's not saying that they're not good founders, but the question is, how come we're not being given that same kind of opportunity and credibility? So yes, to your point, the founders exist actually in overabundance. The problem is that it really takes like a bit of a hearts and minds longer conversation inside of the industry to say, like, why don't we treat people equitably, right? Like, that's a conversation that has been going for a long time, but I think in 2020 it's certainly been pulled to the forefront. And then taking a step back, I do think there's a lot of responsibility that goes to limited partners, or what we call LPs. So just to be clear, as venture investors, we manage, for the most part, other people's money. And that can be high net worth people, celebrities, family offices, but for the most part, it's kind of state and federal government funds, like pension funds. And if we just kind of focus on California, I can say with some pleasure, albeit measured, that California has kind of been on the forefront in terms of diversifying the way by which they allocate those funds, but it's still kind of less than 0.1% of US LP dollars goes into the hands of venture investors that look like the entrepreneurs that we're talking about. So they're just like a fundamental mismatch. However, if you think about a state like California that's super diverse, I don't know what the exact number is, but I think it's like roughly 32 or 33% of the pension fund dollars created to then be put in the hands of venture investors are created by Black and brown people. So like, it's this weird like Robin Hood story in reverse, where we create the dollars, it's then allocated for private equity and venture capital, then not allocated to the people that represent how the dollars were created, and then wealth creation is created in other communities. Like, you really got to take a second and like think about how crazy that is. So it's not saying that like, oh, there are dollars because they were created off of the hours and the careers of people that look like us, but it kind of is. At least that's the mentality and philosophy I have. So I know we veered off, but it's just to say that, I think that not only are our entrepreneurs over mentored, but many times even our investors are over mentored and over cohorted. I'm really excited by how many new faces and backgrounds are getting into the venture capital and investment game. But what I fear again is when I look at many of my colleagues who are new to the industry that don't look like us, like, how come they don't have to go through all these hoops, to get allocated dollars? A lot of these people come from non-traditional backgrounds, have never invested before, or maybe have invested at a firm for a year or two, and now they're off raising big funds. And unfortunately, we're kind of put in a box. So, I think 2020, I'm hoping turns into a bit of a paradigm shift or a watershed moment for both underserved investors of color and certainly entrepreneurs, because where you started, like, we're there in abundance. We just have to be playing by an equal set of rules as the folks that don't look like us.
Yeah, and I know the number's like less than 100, and it might be something like 75. There's 75 Black VCs who have check writing authority in these firms. And my friend Richard Curry put out a number, said 40% of those went to Harvard or Stanford, right? And so you went to Morehouse.
Yeah.
And how do you then get more Black VCs in the door when the successful VCs have previous operational experience, or they over-index on previous operational experience, and B, many come to the table with a check?
Yeah, for sure. So you said a bunch of things there that are really important. When all of the unfortunate events that we referred to happen, kind of March, April, May, and beyond, it happens to us all the time, unfortunately. I saw a lot of my venture capital peers open these office hours, right? They said like, oh, I'm going to dedicate 90 minutes a week for the next 6 months to meet with founders of color. Objectively a good thing, because typically, like, we wouldn't make it into their calendar. So what I did, I said, well, I talk to founders of color all the time, right? Like, just by the nature of who I am, my network, and what I care about. The question is, how can I impact the industry? As one of the few Black partners at a large venture fund with check writing authority, I kind of flipped it and said, okay, well, I'm going to do office hours, 90 minutes twice a week, and speak to any venture fund in the country that doesn't have a Black investor, to really talk through, why don't you have a Black investor? And what are the benefits of having a Black investor? Venture capital, by definition, is about making non-consensus investments in really high-performing and high-potential entrepreneurs. So, referencing my dear friend Richard's analysis, it's the same thing that we talk about, or I talk to my partners here at Bessemer, which is, if we hire another Caucasian male from Harvard and Stanford, like, what's the ROI on partner 15 with that profile? Like, if we don't have those networks covered already, then like, we're not doing our jobs. So I'll say a couple of things. And this is kind of the framework of the discussion of these 90 minutes. And I think I've talked to now 43 firms. And I'm going to be putting out at the end of the year kind of a Medium post with some slides around best practices. But I'm going to cherry pick one thing that I talked to these firms about, which is my entire career, having interviewed with probably 25 firms, at different points of my career, outreach, outbound, this term of like cultural fit has always been a big thing.
Yeah.
It's actually like, I can't stand it.
Yeah.
I'm
glad you bring this up.
Yeah, I don't fit the culture of venture capital. And I guess technically most founders that look like me and you don't fit whatever culture of their portfolio or their typical investment. So here at Bessemer, particularly on the growth fund side, we've totally built in a new hiring philosophy and process. And it's something I talk to all my venture peers about, which is cultural fit's got to go. Like, that's out. What I really care about is values fit and values alignment, not just with the founders, but my colleagues. And I think if you take a step back and you do some work to figure out, like, what are the values that define a really good investor at your firm, or in my case at Bessemer, that's a different conversation. And when we're hiring and when we're interviewing these people, if I'm aligning for values, and I'm not talking about, do you wear Allbirds or Vestas? Like,
Patagonia.
Yeah, I mean, Allbirds are a trash shoe. I wear Jordans to work every day. That's verified.
Hey, if I could pick my foot up right now, you'd see.
Yeah, man. I just scored those new Blazers on the sneakers app this morning. I woke up early at 7 a.m.
I've been taking L's on the sneakers app, by the way. You should invest in Nike and make them fix the sneakers app. How about you?
That's
do that?
Exactly right. If I would, I could. So we eliminate cultural fit. We bring in values fit and score candidates on that. And then what we substitute in is something we call cultural add.
Yes, right.
And that's been probably like the most light bulb moment for most of my close friends who work at peer firms of mine, which is like, oh shit, like we've never actually thought about that. I don't really care as a venture capitalist to go deeper into networks and patterns that we know. We talk about pattern matching, but like the way we generate outsized returns is to pattern match in places that we aren't already. So we talk about cultural ad, and if you really do score people on cultural ad, and this goes for entrepreneurs in your portfolio as well, you really start to ask different questions. You know, what is it unique about your background? What is it about your perspective, your experience that you bring not just to the portfolio, but you know, in my case, to the investment team? And I'll end it here. So I did go to Morehouse. I'm from small town Reston, Virginia. My brother went to HBCU at Hampton, and both of my parents were the first integrated class at Vanderbilt. So education is a big thing in my family. It doesn't mean you have to have quote unquote traditional education to be a great startup founder. But you know, I think what I bring to not just Bessemer, but any firm that I've worked at and probably the broader venture capital industry is just a different perspective. You know, and then on like the venture capital side, you'll hear firms talk a lot about learnings from the community, which is like putting functional leaders, CEOs, head of sales, CFOs from throughout your portfolio of, you know, 10, 20, in our case, over 200 companies together and pulling out best practices. But many times, if your founder base isn't diverse, like there's an exchange of learnings and perspectives that like are just being left out. And not only does that damage or leave kind of opportunity on the table for underserved and underrepresented founders, but actually it leaves opportunity on the table for the folks in our portfolio where they don't get to see our perspective as operators. Like you can't tell me we don't hustle more than anyone else. We've had to our whole lives. Like we've always been told by our parents, you got to be twice as good as everyone else just to get a fair shot. So in terms of like we're underinvested, but we still are expected to generate the same return, there's like an exchange of learning that even across the portfolio, we don't get. So the last thing I'll say on this, you know, you mentioned the statistic 75%, or I'm sorry, less than 75%, or 75 in total venture capitalists have check writing authority. That is very true. And I actually think the number might be way smaller than 75, because check writing authority means different things to different people. But luckily, the number is slowly improving.
Season 2 of the Black Tech Green Money podcast is brought to you by Lexus. For over 30 years, Lexus made driveways the place to celebrate with the December to Remember sales event. Find exclusive offers on popular Lexus models now through January 4th. Experience amazing at your Lexus dealer. You put up a tweet a little while ago that I thought was amusing, but at the same time, you know, it'll make sense why it was a shame to me in a second. So you said VC right now is basically a never-ending episode of 90 Day Fiancé. Tons of online dating, mostly people you've never met who don't need to share much because they have multiple rings already. And while that was amusing, you know what, the part of it, and you said you ended it with, and hoping they pick mine.
Yeah.
And so what I thought was unfortunate about that is when you see our counterparts, our white, you know, entrepreneurs and et cetera, who may have all kinds of term sheets on the table and they're just trying to figure, you know, who they like better, you know, which terms do they like better, et cetera. So they're interviewing you more than you're interviewing them to give them money. When we come to the table, we're hoping Elliot picks us to invest in, and we have way less, in too many cases, way less leverage to get deal terms that are good for us. And so while it was amusing, you know, I thought it was also a shame that we don't come to the table with the same, you know, chutzpah as they might. And what's your response to that? And how do we make Elliot, and this is no disrespect to you, but how do we make you less the prize and the startup the prize?
Yeah, sure. So what's interesting about that is the startup that I've thought about the most, probably the last month, is a startup led by a dear friend of mine who is an African American founder. I can't talk about it just because I don't want to steal the thunder of the company, but they're out raising their Series C now, and it was that dynamic. He had multiple offers on the table, and two of them were unfortunately just kind of higher than I could go on price. And like that's the worst situation actually, because to your point, like that's not always the dynamic at the Series C or D stage where there's another Black founder on the other side of the table from me. I'm sitting there like talk to my wife about it. I talked to my friends about it. I said, what do I do here? Like the market is so crazy and the business is performing really well. And I've actually known this founder now for 4 years, talked to him off cycle. You know, I hope he hears this or sees this, because he'll be laughing the same time. We're texting on a plane and I just couldn't get there on price. So I'll say this, that influences that tweet a bunch, but it also makes me really happy. Because if that is the dynamic for him, then I know the pipeline is coming. Unfortunately, pattern matching at the Series C is very different from pattern matching at the C or the Series A. Like that's the unfortunate challenge. At the C, like there's more data to work with, you know, there's paying customers, there's revenue there. And I think, you know, it demystifies this disconnect between Black and brown founders and the majority of the industry, which doesn't look like them. So just so I make sure I address your question or your comment, I think it's getting better. You know, when I talk to Richard Kirby a lot. He's my closest friend in venture, and oddly, both of our wives went to high school together, well before we ever met each other. So I talk to him a lot. I talked to him last night, funny enough. You know, he spends more time in the early stage. And when we do text, like we'll talk about some early stage hot deals that are led by founders of color. And the dynamic is way different than it was 10 years ago. I'll also shout out Austin Clements at Slauson & Co. in LA. He was tweeting about this the other day, which is like, back in the day, you know, particularly in underserved founders, like you felt like you heard about every deal, particularly if you're a Black venture capitalist. We're now in a place where I don't, which is like good and bad, because I want to hear about everyone, but it's also good because the industry has expanded to the point where it's not just like the same 10 or 15 or maybe even 20 folks that you talk to. It's actually more like 50 to 100. And that bleeds over to like, you know, sports and entertainment, where they're getting into the tech game, or they've got kind of advisors and venture capitalists and angel investors that represent them and have kind of increased their umbrella. In terms of how do we get it there? I hate to throw this answer out again, but like, there's just a continuing hearts and minds conversation that has to happen really inside of the venture capital industry. I'll end the answer here. You know, I write and speak a lot about this thing called diversity theater. It's something I've written about for a really long time. You know, the statistics came out about, I think it was Q3 venture funding. And from a diversity standpoint, there's all these like tweets going out and writing going around and mentoring and all that, but the numbers haven't shown up. What I'll say about that is it's unfortunate, but it takes some time. Like it takes time to actually connect from these office hours to getting to know your business to making the investments. Unfortunately, those decisions are made slower when it comes to us. But I have to hold out hope that the next quarter or two is different. But in terms of diversity theater, you know, all of us have been in this place, you know, speaking personally about my venture career and then, you know, projecting some of the conversations I've had with Black founders, where you know pretty quickly whether someone's just kind of bullshitting you on this diversity thing, right? Right. We're happy to meet with you, but like you can tell, you mentioned something around like operating experience.
That's right.
I'll just put it in my example. As I was going through my career, I used to always, I'm from Virginia, right? We use this term called fetch a rock. And that
Say that one more time.
The term is fetch a rock.
Fetch a rock.
And what that means is, I'll put it in my own experience. When I was interviewing for venture roles throughout my career, you would show up and the job description would say, you need to have X, Y, Z in order to get this job. You would have X, Y, Z, And then they throw a rock and say, go get letter D. It wasn't on the job description, but like, go get letter D. Then you go get letter D, you come back and they throw that rock and they say, oh, go get letter T, right? And I think that happens with founders too, where they, a lot of venture funds will put on their website, this is what we need to see to make a seed investment or a Series A investment. And you're looking at your deck, your product, some of your early traction, say, man, I've got all that. And then within 15 minutes, they're telling you, you need to go find something else. That's when you should know. And that's when you don't want to go fetch that rock. So we've got to get to a point as an industry where we stop throwing that rock. And fortunately, I think the community is talking about it enough where as the faces become more diverse in check writing authority, you know where to go. But there's actually some faces in venture that don't look like us that are making these bets, treating people equitably, and we actually need to like elevate them too and speak about them, because those are the folks you want to spend your time with. Don't waste your time fetching that rock.
Is the answer to create our own firms?
I think it's both. And I'll tell you why. Man, that's a great question. So as someone who's been doing this 15 years, I started my career at an all-Black firm. Still today, the largest Black venture firm in the country to ever exist. Our Fund 5 was a $275 million fund. So a huge part of the equation is certainly starting our own firms. However, until the LP community expands the aperture, my big fear, having started my career in Series A and Series B and seeing successes there, is, you kind of cross that chasm of a Series A, Series B founder of color, and then you show up in the Series C and it's like, well, who's here to talk to? Like who can actually write that 20, 30, 40, $50 million check? That world gets real spooky. And I can say that as a dedicated growth equity investor. We talk about people with check writing authority. I can name 3 Black venture capitalists later stage that I know who have check writing authority. That's like 3. So, it goes back to that tweet and this experience I had with my dear friend who thankfully he's about to announce his Series C investment or his Series C round. Like you feel that pressure where it's like, damn, I'm like 1 of 3 people that can write that check. I can't write all of them. Right. Because like there's a larger pipeline, and thankfully for him, he got an exceptional deal and a great investor around the table. So I think, yes, it is very important that we master our masters and determine our own fate. But unfortunately, the LP community is very happy to back us at kind of this $10 million to maybe $40 million fund size level. Now, there's been a couple of breakout successes. At kind of the like 50 to 125, 150 level. So it's expanding. But for someone like myself, like my average check right now hovers somewhere between like 30 and 50. We got to make sure that we've got people that can treat entrepreneurs equitably through the entire life cycle. Again, all the seed stuff is bubbling up, has been the last 10 years, particularly the last 2. Series A is certainly gotten better, but man, it is a ghost town for me when I go to growth stage conferences. But I know it's coming, right? Like if the investors are there in the seed and the A, and they're raising their Bs, I know as they come through the seed, I'm hoping that I'm uniquely positioned to see all and hopefully support those entrepreneurs as they scale.
Black Tech Green Money is a production of Blavity Afro Tech. It was produced by Morgan DeBon and me, Will Lucas, with additional production support by Love Beach and Raven Earboy. Special thank you to Micah Davis and Sakar Savagnan, like the wine? And yes, that's his real name. Learn more about my guests and other tech disruptors and innovators at afrotech.com. And go get your money. Peace and love.